True believers, and welcome back to another episode of Tier Talk, the series where I go over media franchises old and new to rate them based on my own experiences and preferences before your very eyes. As always, if you find this video entertaining, let me know with a big old thumbs up, and consider hitting the subscribe button for more geeky content from the Northeast's biggest nerdy stuff lover. Without further ado, let's jump right into this list, starting with today's topic of conversation, horror video game franchises. If you guys have been around the channel for about the last year or so, you've probably heard me talk in length about more than one horror game in a long-form video or two, and that's because horror games are one of my favorite genres to play. There's something about the absolute thrill of being stuck in some terrible place, being chased by horrific monstrosities, and solving unique, puzzling narratives that make these kinds of games attractive to me. And as a result, I've played through my fair share of mainstream and indie horror games alike, and I figured it was about time for me to establish where on the food chain I rank them according to my personal preferences. Just remember that this entire list and the things that I'm about to say are just my opinion, so if there's a part of this video where you agree or disagree more, try not to roast me too hard in the comments. Or go ahead and do it anyway, I don't really give a darn. Discussion is discussion. And with that, let's just get right into it, starting with the very first entry on this list, the critically acclaimed Alan Wake series. So for me, Alan Wake is kind of a little bit difficult to talk about, because the game relies very heavily on a narrative. It relies a lot on a person's empathy and intelligence, and playing the games and watching the games are two totally different experiences. I think a lot of people chose to watch people play the second one rather than actually going through and playing it themselves. And because of that, they kind of have two different audiences now. A lot of people played the first Alan Wake game because that's just what was popular during its first release, but I don't think as many people played the second game, even if it's like more critically acclaimed than the first one. That being said, they're still really fun, and there is a lot of effort that was put to make the games work, and you can tell it's more of an art piece rather than just a video game, you know? Like somebody wanted to tell a very specific story, something was personal about this story to them, and they let the world know about it. Alan Wake is entertaining to play, and maybe the first game is a little bit dated by today's standards, but I still don't think that it's actually that bad, but it's also not the best. Also, there's just not very many games in the franchise, so I think when I have to rate it here, it's probably a good idea for me to stick this right in the middle, right in the C tier is probably fine. The games are memorable, and they definitely deserved the awards that they won. I just wish there was a little bit more to them. And almost on the complete other side of the spectrum here, we have the Amnesia franchise. Now, as a whole, Amnesia is pretty goddamn great. These games do what I really like out of video games, and that's kind of teeter on the edge between what's real and what's paranormal. Amnesia: The Dark Descent is probably one of, if not the most well-known horror game in recent history. Like, aside from obvious ones on this list, like, you know, Resident Evil and Five Nights at Freddy's, Amnesia really set itself apart because of The Dark Descent and everybody's infatuation with it upon its release, and gave a lot of YouTubers their career starts, which, you know, good for them. And they just kind of solidified their name after this game came out. I know a lot of people don't look on Machine for Pigs in a highlight, but the games that came out afterwards and all the games under Frictional's belt kind of play similarly. That being said, Amnesia, pretty damn near god tier status here. I'm gonna put the Amnesia franchise in the A, just because there's more winners than there are losers in this series. Even the more modern ones like Rebirth and The Bunker, which are both fantastic games, uphold this game's legacy really well. And on top of being fun to play, they're just scary games. You could put on any one of them in a dark room at night and have fun. Next is kind of a weird outlier I have for this list, because when I was doing research on like what the top 10 or top 15 whatever best horror games and franchises that are out there, Castlevania was one that came up on more than a couple lists, and I think that's kind of funny. The first Castlevania game came out way before my time. I say way before my time. It came out like 10 years before my time. And as odd as it is to say, the original Castlevania game were probably the first console horror games. Like the ones that everybody played and the ones that were intentionally out there to spook you as well as give you a really hard, difficult thing to do. And the series just kind of kept spiraling after that. Like they moved out of their comfort zone. Some of them tried to be scarier than others, and they dealt with like dark gothic elements, but none of them were made intentionally to disgust you or to make you feel dread, or at least, you know, dread in the narrative. Dread in the gameplay was definitely a real thing for a lot of these games. So Castlevania, I think, deserves to be on this list, but I don't think it deserves to be very high on this list, because compared to the rest of these, which are designed to actually be spooky and gross, Castlevania doesn't really do that for you, at least not anymore. The newer games are more based on like trying to have really flashy animations and a really compelling storyline. I'm not saying the games are bad, they're just not that scary. So I'm probably just gonna throw Castlevania in the C tier with Alan Wake, because you can like both of these games for different things, but as a horror franchise, they just kinda lacking something. I am once again asking you to listen to me shill for Dead Space. I want to throw my bias on the table. Dead Space is my favorite horror game. Like the first one, I will play that game over and over again, and I will love it every single time I play it. The game solidified the Resident Evilification of horror games. After Resident Evil 4 came out, a lot of games kind of took on its rendition of what was supposed to be scary, and this is something we'll talk about later, but basically every era has their horror-defining video game, and Dead Space by itself is crazy scary. That being said, the games in the entirety of the franchise kind of have a wavering quality. The first game was definitely meant to scare you. It is built around trying to scare you, but it's also clunky to play. Now the second game is incredibly smooth to play. In fact, it is the best feeling Dead Space game in the whole franchise, but the game relies more on action sequences and scares you with a lot more body horror and jumps rather than trying to create a weird spooky atmosphere. And then the third game, the third game is its own bundle of worms that I don't feel like trying to unpack right now. I can play the third game and have fun, but it definitely doesn't feel anything like the first or second game. It's kind of just a really over-the-top, dramatic, gory shooter, which isn't what the first two games were completely. They were definitely more scary, and the quality tapered off immediately after the second game. I'm going to put the Dead Space in the B tier, because I think if more of the franchise resembled the first game, it would be a smash hit, but the second and third game kind of didn't follow that route, so. Next, we're going to talk about what's probably a bit of a guilty pleasure of mine. I think the F.E.A.R franchise is heavily underrated. Like, there's a lot of games in the franchise, and there's definitely a loyal following for these games, but I don't think enough people talk about them. In fact, I might make a video on this series soon. Comment below if you want to see that come out of my channel or not. I'd be really interested in making it, and maybe enough people to tell me to make it will make me make it. F.E.A.R is awesome. I really like the bullet hell first-person shooter strategy aspect of the game. There is a really compelling narrative here that deals with a lot of different points of view around the same set of characters. And I love how mysterious it is. I like that it doesn't pull its punches with some of the weird shit that it does. F.E.A.R as a franchise is really awesome. and I'm sad that not enough people talk about it. Playing the games is also really fun, and you could tell just by the leap of the first to the second game that there were a lot of people in the development staff that wanted to kind of prove themselves by making these games. They're fun to play, and the story is great, and I don't think enough people are scared of Alma Wade. So I'm going to put this franchise, probably B tier is fine. Like, the games are really great, it's just it doesn't really have that much of an audience right now. They kind of concluded the franchise with the third game, which sucks. But if this series ever got a resurgence, I would definitely be one of the first in line to play it. Obviously, you guys knew I was going to talk about this game. I think I make a Five Nights at Freddy's reference in like every other video that I do. Five Nights at Freddy's is one of those franchises that's just impossible to escape. This fucking brown bear is everywhere, which is like probably fine. I respect this franchise so much sheerly for the amount of people it's brought together, for the amount of inspirational content that it came out with, and for just how many of the stinking games of this series there are. There's what, like 12 games now? It has a book series, it's got a movie, and people are just constantly talking about it. Like, despite MatPat having left Game Theory and it being one of the longest series of theories on that channel, people are still talking about these games. And there's a lot to talk about. I think that of all of the game franchises on this list, you can talk on and on and on about Five Nights at Freddy's with somebody, because just about everybody has probably seen this bear, or Bonnie, or Chica, Foxy, whoever. So I respect the shit out of this game series. I'm probably gonna put it in the same tier as Amnesia, because while Amnesia got a lot of people buzzing talking about it and the game itself is high quality, Five Nights at Freddy's is just a game series that won't die, and I think whether or not you like it or you hate it, you kind of have to respect that so many people like this game series, and at this point in time, it's just not gonna go away. So, in a similar vein to that of the Castlevania series, Left 4 Dead is another one that I hesitated putting on this list, but in the end I kind of wanted to go with it because it's also a widely liked and respected game franchise. The game is definitely supposed to be at least a little scary. Once you've been sitting and playing this game for as long as I have, it stops being spooky scary and more like creepy stuff just continues to happen to you as you play this game. It can be surprising, although I wouldn't know if that crosses into the realm of scary, but the games are also just incredibly fun to play. The first Left 4 Dead is a solid foundation. A co-op game where you play in a group of 4 people playing against AI zombies, and there are special zombies that can do crazy things, and you just have to survive. And every time you play the game, it's going to be at least a little different. You know, hordes are going to come in at different times, special infected are going to spawn in different orders, that sort of thing. And then the second game comes out and adds more features, adds more maps, new characters, and new game modes. Like, there's just a lot of content in the second game that's just supported by a modding community too. My only gripe is that once you've played each campaign like a handful of times, it gets really samey. Like, if you're not playing with a friend group or something all the time, then the game kind of loses its glamour after a little while. And there's also just the 2 games in the franchise. I'm going to put Left 4 Dead in the C tier of games. I think it's kind of comfortable there. I wish there was more to it because there's a solid foundation there, and there's nothing we can do about it because Valve doesn't make video games anymore. So here's another obvious contender for games that deserve all of the hype they get. Outlast is a game series that was specifically designed to scare the shit out of you. Like, this game will make you disgusted, it will make you hate yourself, it will make you cry. The first game is absolutely terrifying. And it's also severely interesting. All of the weird shit that goes on in the laboratories, all of the really personal character studies about mental illnesses and personalities and stuff like that. First game was iconic, and it blew up in similar stature to the first Amnesia game. And then the second game, I don't know. A lot of people say that Outlast fell off with the second game. And I mean, I don't agree with that, but I can see why you would think that. The themes are incredibly different. The game relies on a very personal narrative to its characters rather than just there's an evil conglomerate doing evil conglomerate things. But I think the characters are just so much more interesting in the second one, and the gameplay really expands upon what happened in the first one. Like, the chase sequences got kind of monotonous, so in the second game they changed it up so that way you got chased from multiple angles. They opened it up from just the cat and mouse rooms into gigantic open fields, and some of the characters are just genuinely, like, better. I don't think anything is going to scare me more than Eddie fucking Gluskin, but they get pretty close. That being said, the games are still really small, and instead of building off of the narrative of the world that they set up in the first and second game, they converted into a multiplayer game for the next outing in their franchise. And I think I saw somewhere that a third game is in development, which is great because I think the Outlast Trials has already worn off its charm. I'm going to put Outlast as a franchise in the B tier because, again, it's not quite big enough. There's only like the 2.5 games in the series, and I think they just still have more that's yet to come. Alright, now we're going to deal with the Mac Daddy, motherlode of all horror video games, Resident Evil. Resident Evil has some pretty humble beginnings, you know? Like, it was just this hybrid of CG live action, video gamey nonsense, zombie game about exploring a mansion where nothing makes sense, and then there's like a super deep science fiction plot with zombies at the very core of it. This game shouldn't have worked. It shouldn't have done well, but it did really good, and then it got a sequel, and then it got another sequel, and then it got another sequel, and the game is just blown up. Like, I think we're at number 8 for mainline entries, and then there's all the side story ports, then there's the live action movie franchise, then there's an animated movie franchise. There's just so much to Resident Evil now. And we're in the remake territory season where, like, they want to remake every couple of games so that way they look good in a modern engine. I don't think Capcom is gonna touch 5 or 6 because those are still pretty new, but also they're like really gross and people don't like those games as much. But as a franchise of playing games, Resident Evil has like more than earned its reputation for quality, corny video game nonsense. There's something really special about it, and I can't quite put my finger on it, but I just know that it got all of the hype that it deserved. So for this franchise, I think there's no better place to put it than at the top. Resident Evil is awesome, the games are scary, the gameplay is interesting, and the narratives are so fucking convoluted, but you can't help but love all that comes with it. It's graphic, it's mature, it's scary, and they're fun to play. And to me, I could say that about basically every single game, except for maybe like 6, but we all have black sheeps in the franchise. And last but not least, we have Silent Hill. Now, Silent Hill is basically everything that Resident Evil ever was, except probably neutered to the most minute degree. Resident Evil is like a globe-trotting adventure that has a lot of characters and is a gigantic franchise, but Silent Hill is like very personal. The games try very hard to make their stories about a person, and I think that resonated with a lot of its player base. Like, it felt like a small narrative that was talking directly to the player, and unfortunately, not everybody agreed with that setup. Like, some of the earlier games like 3 and even 4 were able to kind of divert that mission statement. Like, the games were incredibly personal to Henry and Cheryl, but they were also just very small stories compared to games in its own medium. Especially Silent Hill 2, which is like still an incredible game with a dense narrative that's really effective. But not everybody likes that. Not everybody likes that psychological aspect to it. Some people just want like monsters to kill. And the main difference between Silent Hill games and Resident Evil games is that Silent Hill focuses way more on the survival part of survival horror, and Resident Evil just kind of gives you big guns to deal with your monsters, which definitely has its appeal, but Silent Hill just isn't that. Silent Hill is very close and very small, and deserves all of the acclaim that it gets, but it's probably not as legendary on this list. Like, Resident Evil has so many bangers, but Silent Hill just kind of has like the one or two games that are outstanding compared to the rest of them in their own franchise. There's also some massive turd Silent Hill games. I'm going to put Silent Hill comfortably in the A tier. When you think scary, when you think things that'll absolutely spook you, you definitely think of Silent Hill, but you always usually think about it after like Resident Evil. Alright, so I'm like really comfortable with this list. Like, I think this is a pretty decent horror game franchise list. Maybe at some point there will be more for me to add into this grid, but for right now this is kind of what I could think of on short notice, and games that I have played a fair majority of within their own franchises. Like, if you don't see other games on here that are very obviously like spooky horror games like Dead Rising or like Poppy Playtime or something, it's just because I haven't played those games. And maybe like in a future list or something, like next year's Halloween, I'll be able to have more on this list, but I just don't have them right now. If you guys have suggestions for me, if you have like scary games that you think people have to play if they call themselves a horror game fan, then definitely throw those my way, because I have played each of these games on this list to death, and I'm definitely looking for more things that will make me hesitate before shutting the lights off before bedtime. Do you guys agree with this list? Do you guys disagree? Let me know in the comments below. I definitely look forward to having those conversations with you. Thank you very much for watching, everybody. I appreciate each and every single one of you. Don't forget to be awesome, and be kind, and rewind. Excelsior.